Okay, we're live. All right. Well, hello there. My name is Youri, and I'm here for a Black Agenda Reports news commentary and analysis from a Black left perspective. And we are with a very special guest. We're with Rick Sterling, independent journalist whose work has appeared on Globalresearch.ca and Minpress News. We're very lucky to have Rick with us because we're going to be talking about all things Syria and try to get to as much topics today. So, Rick, first of all, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here, Youri.
All right, so the first question that I have to ask you is you just got back from Syria, and you were describing that it is a Syria completely unlike what we occasionally, when the media does decide to talk about Syria, and it's a sort of doom and gloom post-apocalyptic situation, but you were there and you say it's the complete opposite.
Yeah.
So explain to our listeners and our readers what the reality was for you when you were there.
Yeah, I was there participating in a conference, a 2-day conference, hosted by the General Federation of Trade Unions of Syria. They invited fellow trade unionists and some journalists from 35 countries around the world to come to Syria, and it was a great meeting. It was great to network with people from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, and Europe, people who are in solidarity with the people of Syria and the struggle to have independence for that country. So some of the striking things to me, one of the striking things was just walking around downtown Damascus. I've been there 2 times previously, in 2014 and 2015, so it wasn't totally new to me, but every time I've gone there, I've been impressed by the huge throngs of people who are walking about doing their daily life. They're in restaurants, they're in bars, they're having ice cream on the street.
Oh, wow.
I was there on the last day of the Damascus International Fair. I'd never been to that before, and frankly, I didn't know what it exactly was. I had the impression that it was mostly a business or a business type of fair, and yet it was quite different. There were children's games and activities. There's fireworks, there's live music, there's all sorts of arts and crafts exhibits and huge halls with this. On the last day of the fair, there were 300,000 visitors. That gives you a sense of the size of it. It was a huge area, a huge space, perhaps one square mile. There were, it was a huge traffic jam getting to the place and parking, going in. It was kind of amazing to see, and this is the spirit of the people stands out. That's one of the things that's impressive to me. So overall, it was a very good trip. I mentioned that we went to a couple of villages in the province of Homs, and we delivered some humanitarian support to people who have suffered in the war. And that was a new project for a Syria Solidarity Movement, but it was all the spirit of the people and the resilience stands out to me.
But how long is that? But how long is that glimpse of peace, normality, and stability going to last? Because it still seems as if the Gulf states, namely Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and it seems Israel is trying to start up its colonial divide and conquer routine again, and it still seems as if the U.S., UK, France, and Canada still seem determined to have the sort of Assad must go doctrine in their head, and of course, they are supporting. They are supporting de facto the Islamist rebels, the ISIS and the al-Nusras of the world. So how long will that will that peace and stability that you got a glimpse of in Syria last with the West and the Gulf still determined to oust Assad?
Yeah, well, I think you're right that they have not given up on the effort to prolong the war and the bloodshed and the conflict. It's in the past years, there's been a steady process of the Syrian government recapturing and stabilizing and bringing peace to different parts of the country. The vast majority of Syria, the populated areas, is safe now. In the north, there's Idlib province, which is controlled, which has the it's Al Qaeda. It's a Syrian branch of Al Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or whatever name you give it. It's basically the equivalent of Al Qaeda in Syria. And in the eastern Syria, in the desert region, which is also the oil-producing region, you have 12 to 14 U.S. bases strung across that country. Obama said there were not going to be any boots on the ground. Well, that turned out to be not true. There are boots. In fact, there's approximately 14 bases there. The U.S. continues to try to divide Syria, and they are supporting what they call the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are predominantly Kurdish forces that they are trying, as part of their plan to divide and conquer, to split off a part of Syria from the rest of the country. So as much as things have advanced, as much as things have progressed, it's not over. And the West and their allies in the Gulf and Israel continue to subvert that process and prevent Syria from regaining total control of its area, eliminating terrorism, and significantly starting to rebuild the country.
Now, I know this may sound like a silly question, but it's a question that has to be asked because Syria. I know Rania Khalek has described Syria as the worst poorly reported war in all of her political life, in her career as a journalist. So I do have to ask this question, which is, if you were a journalism professor or a history teacher, or you got the chance to go on any of the corporate news outlets or the state-run media outlets, or even left-leaning outlets, which also have been very poor on Syria, how would you explain to them how the conflicts came about? Who are the main actors involved in this ongoing tragedy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're right. In fact, even it's great to hear Rania Khalek say that, and she's not alone. Even a former the New York Times former foreign reporter Stephen Kinzer has said that essentially the same thing. And Patrick Coburn, the journalist for the Independent, the Patrick Coburn has said everything we've heard about Syria and Iraq may be not true. And this is definitely the case, that there's been a mountain of misinformation. Now, it wasn't innocent misinformation. It was planned misinformation, which some people call disinformation. I think a key question is whether the conflict there is a civil war or is it a war of aggression by foreign states that are seeking to overthrow the country? And I think it's the latter. The evidence of foreign support for foreign fighters is overwhelming. It's public knowledge that billions of dollars, not millions, but billions of dollars have been spent arming, equipping, training, and otherwise supplying and promoting hundreds of thousands of foreign fighters, and as well as some number of Syrians who are basically, since they're taking money from a foreign government, they can be classified as mercenaries. So that's all kind of well documented. In addition, there has been an information war, which involves the disinformation about what's going on in Syria, the exaggeration of opposition to Syria, the demonization of the Syrian government, and basically covering up the true nature of the quote-unquote rebels, and basically exaggerating the claims, or creating the false claims about so-called atrocities by the government. Mm-hmm. So I mean, at the bottom line, I think the key to understanding it is whether it's a Syrian conflict, a civil war, or a war of aggression, and it's very clearly, I think the evidence is overwhelming that it's the latter.
So you think that actually what we really are seeing in Syria is actually a sovereign nation trying to defend itself against a coalition of nations. So the U.S., Canada, the U.K., France, but also Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who may not have their own boots on the ground, but just like a CIA war basically is, basically our American soldiers. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, we know through WikiLeaks, has revealed that Saudi Arabia and Qatar has exported ISIS into Syria, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar are the allies of the United States, Brits, and France and Canada.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in a way, it's astounding that Syria has withstood this, because you had not only the extremely wealthy Gulf monarchies. Now, let's be honest about this. These are not democratic states in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They're monarchies. United Arab Republic, United Arab Emirates. Yeah. In addition to the whole group of Western countries, from the UK, from the US, Canada, Australia, Belgium, France, Germany, all of them have set out and have contributed to the effort to overthrow Syria, which would have resulted in something like Libya, except worse. So those are the options.
And this leads me to media reporting, because now recently, a year ago, Hollywood released a film about the slain journalist Marie Colvin, who was a reporter for the Murdoch Times, the Times in Britain. And apparently this movie was based on a Vanity Fair piece, which I assume depicts her, as does the movie, positively as a wonderful journalist and as this sort of free speech, First Amendment martyr, because she was slain, and the report was that it was I think the report was that it was the Syrian government forces that slain her, and then you hear her, she's been compared to Martha Gellhorn. And her dispatches editorially had the "Assad must go" line, and sort of advocated the responsibility to protect doctrine. Now, you wrote a piece, I think it was last year or earlier this year, about Marie Colvin, and can you explain who Marie Colvin was and why, and how her death plays into this propaganda that Assad must go, we are supporting moderate rebels, and her level of deception in all of this?
Right. Well, first I will say that it's very unfortunate that Marie Colvin died, and there was a French photographer, Remy Olchak, who died at the same time, and that is very unfortunate. At the same time, we have to recognize that they had both entered a conflict zone. They were basically under the custody of the armed insurgents in a small part of the city of Homs called Baba Amr. And that area, that was in February of 2012. The area had been captured in the previous months by the insurgents. Most of the civilians had left the violence, and because they didn't support the terrorists, and other people had left because they had left for obvious reasons that the violence was coming to them. The armed insurgents had started by sniping all people on the street. They had been killing anybody who was a state worker. They had been killing Syrian soldiers. So they had taken over a part of the city. And so, like any state, like it would happen anywhere in the world, when an armed group takes over a neighborhood, it's going to, and it's basically challenging the authority of the state. It's killing people. That can't be tolerated. And it's the same in Syria as anywhere else. What Marie Colvin did in her article was she portrayed it as a region, as a part of the city. She basically portrayed all of Homs being under siege by the Syrian government. That was not true. I visited Homs in 2014, just 2 years after that incident happened, and I was amazed at how normal Homs was. You could drive around there and not even know there was a war going on. So the destroyed buildings and the bloodshed and the conflict was confined to several parts of, but very specific parts of the city. Baba Amr, the town or the neighborhood of Baba Amr, was one of those zones. So she misportrayed it. She said there were 28,000 children and civilians there. That was a lie. It was almost no civilians there. There were only fighters and their families of fighters there for the most part. The vast majority of civilians had left long ago, and then she basically encouraged the West to go to war with the Assad government. So there was kind of multiple deceptions. She was there for just a few days. As I say, she was basically she was in the media center of the insurgents, and it was attacked by the Syrian government, and she died. It's very unfortunate, but that's what happens when you go into a war zone. Now, by contrast, some 64 Syrian media workers, broadcasters, reporters, filmmakers have died in the conflict. So in contrast with the huge amount of publicity that Marie Colvin received, movies, books, articles, countless articles, in the West, the Syrian reporters are largely unknown. And at the end of that article, I included a photograph of the mural in front of the Syrian state TV, which has many of the people from the media who have died in the war.
Now, Marie Colvin. Now, do you think it's possible that because of some of the horrors she must have witnessed, I assume by government forces, that it must have clouded her judgment into the people who were fighting against Assad, and then basically a lot of her journalism was basically half truths, but half truths, which are the most cynical forms of propaganda, or that most of the time she was basically engaging in atrocity propaganda.
Well, I think, sad to say, Marie Colvin was largely a propagandist. She would take a sensational incident and magnify it and portray it as representing the whole. And sad to say, Marie Colvin played a part in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. She promoted Ahmed Chalabi. She co-wrote stories with Judy Miller. She was a major propagandist for promoting the invasion of Iraq. And then the same thing in Libya. She promoted the stories about so-called atrocities that turned out to be not true. She wrote sensational stories about women being raped by Gaddafi troops, and these stories were later on confirmed to be false.
Yeah, so, I believe one of the most disgusting propagandas that was leveled at Gaddafi and black Libyans was that he was giving them Viagra so that they could commit mass rapes. Amnesty International, Amnesty International, human rights frauds. Human Rights Watch. Cycled a lot of those stories. So Marie Colvin was so for people who aren't even familiar with her journalism, she engaged in that level of deception.
Yes, she was promoting Western regime change operations in Iraq, in Libya, and she wanted the same thing for Syria, and that's why she was on the front page, or she was a prominent writer at the Sunday Times of London, Rupert Murdoch's newspaper. Numerous people, journalists say she was a very, nice personality. She was fun to be with. I'm not talking. I can't make any judgments about her character. She may have been a fine person. She probably was, but her reporting was extremely biased, and objectively, she played a role in the wars, the invasions, the occupations, the atrocities committed by the West against Iraq, Libya, and Syria.
Now, why are well, actually, yeah. But before, actually, yeah, that's probably a good segue to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about the media in Syria, which is, why are so many left-leaning outlets, left-leaning organizations, and NGOs, and I'm thinking about Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Middle East Monitor, Democracy Now! In several programs on Pacifica radio, and then outlets like Jacobin, and then even big socialist organizations, many of them which identify as Trotskyists. Why have they jumped the sharks, so to speak, on Syria compared to Iraq, and to a certain extent Libya, where there was a little bit of pushback against Libya, not enough, but why has so much of the left-leaning outlets jumped the shark on Syria and followed the line that Assad must go? There are moderate secular rebels fighting him, and the U.S. is not supporting ISIS. ISIS just came about because of the brutal dictator Assad being too oppressive towards his people, and all that jazz. When really Syria is Iraq, is Libya, it's Afghanistan even all over again.
Well, that's a good question. If I knew the answer, I might have a solution, and we could change that all around. It would be great if we could do that. I think one significant factor is the millionaire NGOs. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders. I think they play a significant role. And, in some areas, in some conflicts, they do good work. The problem is that on critical international issues which involve basically the capitalist West against either socialist or basically a country that is seeking independence, seeking self-determination, they want to decide their own government. In Syria, Syria is a semi-socialist state. They have private enterprise, but a lot of the industry is state-owned. There's free education, free health care. Syria, I think on some of those issues, the funders of those big NGOs are billionaires, are governments, either behind the scenes or directly. They're getting support from government. There's a revolving door between the people at the head of Human Rights Watch, for example, and the U.S. government. And a lot of people think that those big NGOs are independent. They claim to be non-governmental. They purport to have some level of objectivity and neutrality, and in fact they don't. And so I think one factor is the confusion that is generated, and frankly the hostility toward all of the propaganda around Syria that's been projected by Human Rights Watch has had a big effect in confusing parts of the left.
Yeah, and of course that definitely leads to, because of the good reputation that Amnesty, Doctors Without Borders, and Human Rights Watch has, whether it's deserved or not, that's another topic. But because they've jumped the shark on Syria, or they've decided that that Hugo Chavez or Aristide or Nicolas Maduro or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, because those organizations will depict them as left-wing tyrants, and for a left public which oftentimes should always be skeptical of Western wars, but the moment they see these NGOs with these good reputations saying that, hey, Assad is a brutal dictator and he is massacring anyone who's not part of his Shia sect, that gets many people on the left to basically jump the shark and go and support the the R2P doctrine and the Assad must go line, right?
Yeah, exactly. As well, another source of information and disinformation nowadays is various United Nations agencies. And
explain
that. And that they again are considered by many people to be objective, to be neutral. Well, if the United Nations says it, even though there's many different bodies within the United Nations, there's tremendous distortions that go on. Saudi Arabia is one of the major forces influencing one of the human rights organizations at the United Nations. So there's a lot of one has to really look at a source of information in some detail to determine whether or not it's got a motive, or whether it's truly objective or not.
And do you think that also explains? I mean, we touched a little bit about Qatar. Do you think that explains why a lot of Middle Eastern news outlets, which get either partial funding from Qatar or are completely funded by Qatar, such as Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, and Middle East Monitor. That's why they have followed this line that Assad must go, and engaging in the kind of propaganda that we discussed Marie Colvin participated in.
Yeah, well, there's an old saying, who pays the piper calls the tune, and it's largely correct. It's most of the time it's correct. And so the distortions of Al Jazeera have been, early on, were so bad that they even had prominent journalists from Al Jazeera quitting in disgust.
But yet so many people on the left still, I mean, talk to them about RT. They completely shun RT and don't want anything to do with RT because they say it's Russian propaganda. Mention Press TV, the Iranian English state outlet. They completely shun. They completely shun that. And yet Al Jazeera, though, has been given a pass, though, and many and many so-called independent outlets like Democracy Now! And much of Pacifica and other left-leaning outlets more or less recycle Al Jazeera's reporting, whether it be Syria or other hot topics of the day.
Right. Well, I think it underscores the need to look at and examine critically all reports, no matter the source, whether it's from RT or Al Jazeera. Look at it, look at alternative views, and then make an assessment. Generally, of course, some things are you can generally rely on, but as we've seen with Al Jazeera, as much as some of their reporting on the invasion and occupation of Iraq was good, their reporting on Syria has been terrible, frankly.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that instead of having a movement which is consistently anti-imperialist, we now have people who are selectively anti-war.
Yes.
So it seems, Iraq, everybody was was against that war, and if you watched Al Jazeera, it got you to be against that war. Whereas Libya, it was split, and Syria, now there's been, sadly there's been a lot of bitter divisions amongst the anti-war movement, in which you have some people who watch the Al Jazeeras, who read the Amnesty International reports of the world, and they are determined Assad must go, and then you have others, such as Min Press News, Global Research, and I can speak for Black Agenda Reports that that some of our contributors have also been marginalized and bullied and silenced and deplatformed because of the truthful reports and speaking out, saying that no, Syria is Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya all over again.
Yeah. Well, hats off to Black Agenda Report for fighting the good fight and standing up to these attempts to bully and browbeat, and really refusing to give in to the widespread deceptions that are going on.
Yeah, I know that Rania Khalek even lost her job at Electronic Intifada, which was in my opinion totally unfair. Her dismissal just because of her reporting on because of her reporting on Syria, and until to this day, although she's a host of a popular program which gets a lot of views on Facebook, but still is marginalized and still effectively censored just because of her positions, just because of her her journalism regarding Syria.
And that's a good example, Youri, because I think, as I recall, Rania ran into trouble because she attended a conference in Damascus, And she was actually there just last weekend at this conference that we held in recent days. But her first, I think it was possibly her first time ever in Syria. She went there, and the extent of censorship by the left is extreme. Basically, they don't want you, and they don't want anyone to go and look at the reality. They don't want somebody, a journalist, or to go to Damascus. There's some people from the labor union, from the trade union movement, who went on this, on this trip to Syria recently, and they've received some very negative questions on their return. Basically, and of course, Tulsi Gabbard, she went there, she talked with Assad. Basically, they don't want, because they are threatened. They are threatened that if you go there, it won't look like the Western media has portrayed it. Assad won't look like the brutal dictator that the Western media purports him to be. The people, if one goes there and talks with people in the streets randomly, you won't hear the message that the West gives, or that some Syrian voices, which are hostile to the Syrian government, give, purporting to be speaking for all Syrians, even though they might not have lived in Syria for 25 years. So the Western media and the Western political establishment is threatened by people going there and seeing for themselves, because the reality is so different than what's portrayed in the media.
And I wanted you to comment because that's a good segue into. I mean, we've all read, Professor Chomsky and Ed Herman's Manufacturing Consent, and there's that wonderful chapter which Ed Herman was a big contributor about, the sort of worthy victims and unworthy victims that you see in corporate media. But it seems on the left-leaning media and the NGOs, there seems to also be. Would you agree that there is a worthy victim and unworthy victim when it comes to Syria and compared to Yemen? So Yemen, which is being completely obliterated by the Western-backed Saudi UAE-led coalition, which is killing anything that moves. Every man, woman, and child is an enemy combatant in the eyes of the West and the Gulf states there. But you see this, and you hear many anti-war organizations, having these campaigns. Stop the bombing of Yemen. Bernie Sanders's bill, was gaining traction to try to stop the war in Yemen. But when it comes to Syria, which is also the victim of a Western-backed Gulf coalition of war of aggression, it seems that the victims of that, which are the same as Yemen, except Syria is much stronger in defending itself, that is the unworthy victim.
Well, there's it's an interesting contrast. It seems like one can oppose the aggression against Yemen much more readily than one can oppose the aggression against Syria. I mean, opposing the aggression against Yemen is very good, and obviously we all support the Bernie Sanders resolution, and the House passed the resolutions calling for the ending of U.S. support for that war. That's a good thing, but for some reason it's much more difficult in the case of Syria. Regarding the worthy and the unworthy victim, I think that's where Marie Colvin's, that example, Marie Colvin can be portrayed, can be romanticized, can be glorified, and yet the dozens of Syria media workers who have died reporting on their own country, They're not strangers. They're reporting on their own countries. They're the unworthy victims that aren't even, they're just ignored in the West. There's another thing that I want to point out that was very striking to me that may be of interest to your listeners, Youri, and that is, we made a 12-hour trip to the province of Homs and visiting those small villages that I mentioned earlier. Every town you drive through in Syria, there are banners. You see posters of martyrs. They're in every town, 5, 10, 15, 20 young men and some women from the town who have died in the conflict. And it's amazing. You never hear that in the West. You never hear about the Syrian people who died defending their own homeland. And yet, that's the reality. 100 to 150,000 Syrians, either in the National Defense Forces, in the Syrian Arab Army, or in one of the militias, has died in this war of aggression. They are ignored in the West. They honor them in each village, and you can see it's quite moving, actually, because they're young people such as yourself, not just 5, 10, in every village. You see these portraits of people on the wall, and it's a sign of how distorted our media is, and they're ignored, they're whitewashed, and somehow they've been disappeared from the conflict.
Yeah, and again, I think it's even it's even more depressing when left-leaning media engages in that. Yes. And which is a perfect segue to then this question, which is you've expressed support for Tulsi Gabbard's bid for the U.S. presidency. So why do you support Tulsi Gabbard's bid in the U.S. presidency, and compare and contrast her to Bernie Sanders when it comes to the big issues of imperialism, Syria being Syria being being an example of it?
Well, I started paying attention to Tulsi Gabbard when I heard the news that she had visited Syria with Dennis Kucinich and seen the situation on the ground. I think they had an impromptu meeting with Assad. But I thought it showed a lot of courage, political courage, and wisdom, really, to go there and just hang on a moment, Youri.
No problem.
Yeah. So let's see. Where were we?
You were talking about Tulsi Gabbard and the peace. The peace trip, the peace fact-finding trip she did with Dennis Kucinich.
Right. So, and when she came back from that trip to Syria, she said she put a resolution before Congress, stop arming terrorists, and in a nutshell, it said it all. That's what we're doing. We're arming terrorists, and I started following her at that time. I went to the event when she came to the Bay Area a couple of times, and she comes across as very genuine, very sincere, she's charismatic. I think the fact that she has seen war firsthand. She was on a medical team at the height of the invasion of Iraq, and she deployed twice to the Middle East. I think all those things give substance, and I think she's the real deal. She says flat out that foreign policy is the key thing that she's working on, and that U.S. regime change policy is what has to change. She talks about the need for diplomacy with Russia and China, which is very different than some of the Democratic candidates who seem to think it's a good idea to stoke hostility after hostility.
Yeah.
We've had the embassy of Russia in San Francisco has been shut down. Embassy.
Oh wow.
There's been all sorts of detrimental moves. Of course, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the U.S. withdrew from that recently. The trend is very negative. And where does the trend go? It goes to war, frankly. And this is of paramount importance. And unlike Tulsi Gabbard, another thing that is unique and positive about her is she does not seem very partisan. It's the issues that she deals with, and whether it's negotiations instead of conflict, whether it's the U.S. not interfering in Venezuela or Syria. It's for the Syrian people or the Venezuelan people to determine their own government. Whether it's releasing Julian Assange, what he did was, publish a material that was true. These are things that make Tulsi Gabbard stand out, and I'm hoping that her candidacy continues into the future. I mean, at this point, I think the Democratic establishment is gunning for her. Frankly, I don't think they liked the fact that she called out their corruption against Bernie Sanders in 2016. I don't think they liked her more recent calling out of the hypocrisy of Kamala Harris.
Top Kamala Harris.
Yes.
As we call her at Black Agenda Reports.
Right. So Tulsi's a bit of a standout, and for the same reason that you and I may like her, other people don't like her. And so at this point, I think our best hope.
That's what I wanted to get out is and I think it's a continuation of the theme, which is this bizarre controlled opposition left, which seems to be very selective in which wars they like and which wars they're opposed to, and again, it seems as if the Yemenis are worthy victims and Syrians are unworthy victims. So when Bernie Sanders, who Whitney Webb of Mint Press News actually scrutinized that his stopping the war in Yemen wasn't left a loophole which continues actually the war in Yemen and fighting Al Qaeda there, but yeah, it seems as if you're opposed to the war in Yemen, you're very popular, but opposed to the war in Syria, very unpopular, which I find quite strange because Tulsi Gabbard's Stop Funding Terrorism Act would have basically killed two birds with one stone. It would have not only ended the war in Syria and the alliance of the Gulf states and their exporting these Wahhabi thugs into Syria, but that also would have ended the war in Yemen, and yet she's completely tarred and feathered in many left-leaning publications, notably The Intercept, Jacobin, and even the Young Turks Network.
Right. Yeah. I think we need to push back to push back there, and I also think we need to reach out to libertarians, some people who we don't agree with on everything, but we agree on the issue of war and peace and non-intervention. Libertarians, some conservatives also, and that again is an area where Tulsi Gabbard is exceptional. She would, frankly, I cannot imagine Elizabeth Warren getting any support from conservatives or people or libertarians with her positions. I can imagine Tulsi Gabbard getting support from a lot of those people. So I believe that in in the national election, to the extent that it's going to come down to Republican Trump versus whoever the Democratic nominee is, I think Tulsi Gabbard would prevail.
she also hasn't jumped the shark too fully on all the anti-Russia conspiracy theories that are going on, and Bernie Sanders and I know Sandinistas do not like to be reminded of this, but the guy did jump the shark on anti-Russia conspiracy theories, which to me he has not only thrown his supporters under the bus, those that protested for him at the floor of the DNC and outside of the DNC during 2016, but he has also he also has basically discredited Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and smeared them. He didn't support the DNC lawsuit. And Tulsi Gabbard, it was quite remarkable that she resigned from the DNC, and she said that, and she already had expressed that the DNC leadership was too much in the tank for Hillary Clinton, so she was going to resign and just fully, openly support Bernie Sanders. And when the WikiLeaks scandal came out of what the DNC did to Bernie, she still went on stage, at the DNC and still endorsed, Bernie Sanders in that very, Gandhian charming way of hers. And yet there still is quite a lot of, there is quite a lot of hostility against her because of that. But there's even a lot of hostility against her because I think some Sanders supporters just want Bernie regardless of his imperial skeletons in his closets.
Well, my hope is Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard as defense secretary.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful.
I think that as much as I, share your reservations and criticisms of either the opportunism or the lack of understanding of Sanders in some areas, his caving in on Venezuela, his caving in on Russiagate, I think there would be a dramatic change with his presidency compared to anybody else. So. That's the best hope at this point, I think.
I think my only hesitation on Bernie Sanders, and I know much of the Black Agenda Report team also shares with it, is the fact that that many of us feel that he's too much of a socialist reformist at home, but still an imperialist overseas, especially with regards, with regards to Venezuela. But leaving Bernie Sanders aside and continuing on the the Syria regime change brigade. I know when we were corresponding, you were asking me if I had read Max Blumenthal's epic tour de force book, The Management of Savagery, and I wanted to so I want to talk about one chapter in that book because Blumenthal talked about the slain MP of the Labour Party, Joe Cox, and Joe Cox, when she was alive, Blumenthal details this in his book, but she was a supporter of the White Helmets, and she was basically a supporter of getting rid of Assad, and apparently she had marginalized Jeremy Corbyn, who has an honorable track record of being opposed to all these all these imperialist adventures, and he was opposed to arming the Syrian rebels. He was opposed to bombing Syria, and so apparently Joe Cox smeared Jeremy Corbyn and marginalized him. Then she supported the White Helmets, which Vanessa Beeley exposed was this Islamist front group supported by the Gulf states and the West, and then Joe and then of course Joe Cox is murdered during the Brexit campaign, But bizarrely enough, the people who are involved in her foundation were all people who support the R2P doctrine, whether it was in Yugoslavia, whether it was Libya. Some of them even support the Iraq War. But Jeremy Corbyn himself, who's had an honorable anti-war track record, he whitewashes Joe Cox's legacy and lionizes lionizes her legacy. And I'm wondering why do you think Jeremy Corbyn would be doing that, lionizing somebody whose foreign policy the complete opposite of what of what he's been campaigning his entire life.
I should mention that I've got to go out in about less than
problem.
About 5 minutes. So now regarding that question, Jeremy Corbyn is a politician, and Joe Cox was dead, had died, and I suspect that he was putting on his political hat, and he was looking on the rosy side of the picture. Regarding, and I'm sure that Joe Cox believed everything she said and what she advanced about the white helmets. That's the white helmets, and I've written. In fact, I wrote one of the first exposés of the white helmets. The white helmets is a PR. It's a masterpiece of PR work, because the white helmets have confused so many people. It, of course, was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. It
got
won
an Oscar.
The movie got an Oscar. There have been multiple movies made about the white helmets. There's been multiple stories. You've had praise from Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, all over the world.
Democracy Now! Never seems to miss a chance to broadcast them favorably.
Of course, it's a masterpiece of public relations propaganda, basically, that has effectively served to demonize the Assad government and to whitewash, to cloak what's really going on in these areas. That the only areas that they work in are the areas that are dominated by what I refer to as the Al Qaeda. Jabhat al-Nusra is the Syrian name for the organization. That's where they work, but they serve as a distraction, and they've allowed the West to pour money into those areas, tens of millions of dollars, as well as to create videos and to create propaganda, which then they use to pretend that that's a true objective image of what's going on in the area. So the white helmets have the name white helmets is a PR construct itself. They initially had another name, and then they were given the catchy phrase, the white helmets. Ironically, there's another white helmets which has existed for decades, called Cascos Blancos in Argentina. So they fabricated the name, and they began by when the terrorists took over parts of Aleppo and parts of other cities. They commandeered some of the ambulances and some of the fire engine trucks, and they killed some of the real civil defense workers, and they captured them. And since then, they've had hundreds of millions of dollars poured into support them. So what they've done is create videos. What they've done is provide a cover for the U.S. to provide support for the occupation of areas of Syria by Al Qaeda.
And yeah, that's remarkable. But it's even more remarkable that that somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, with his superb track record, and I mean, this is a guy that's rubbed shoulders with some of the big anti-imperialist voices of the left in Brits, and people like Tariq Ali, but yet he does not seem to be campaigning anymore on stopping the war in Syria. And then of course, it goes back to, I just think it's, sort of bizarre. I mean, I understand that he has to say, rest in peace to Joe Cox, but then to prop up her regime change racket is.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think the onus is on us to turn up the heat, to increase the awareness. I think a lot of people now, I think the white helmets, I think the gloss is off. A lot of people know there's something fishy. It's not quite what it seems. It's not quite what it's meant, what it's portrayed to be. I think we've managed, and Vanessa has done tremendous work in this regard. I think we've managed to show that there's something fishy here, and if Jeremy Corbyn is not aware, he needs to be aware, and it's up to us to help him understand that.
Well, here's hoping that the anti-war movement, or as I prefer, the anti-imperialist movement, here's hoping they wake up from the deep coma they're in and start realizing that it's not just the corporate media that you need to avoid, but even hate to use the Thatcher phrase, but the enemy within, because there's even many within the left which aren't sincere. And buy into the propaganda of the Amnesty Internationals of the world and others, and we have to be vigilant in the fight against that. And although Glenn wouldn't agree with me on this, but even a little bit of a sort of a left-right alliance, as you mentioned, Tulsi Tulsi appealing to libertarians, the anti-imperialist right. Yeah, that all of that needs to come together to push back against the latest bloody imperial adventures that's happening.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for Youri. I think I wish you well, and let's talk again sometime.
Thank you, Rick, and I hope that this will be the start of many conversations in the future. Black Agenda Reports with you. So thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time for us. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.